Hey, welcome back to our second introduction video, all about the history of basically how long have people been using herbs. So this is so interesting because I find that when we talk about the history of medicine and the history of herbs, we can get into some topics that can be somewhat controversial, and I'm just going to tell it from my perspective. So where you can read about this more if you want to, is not required, is Green Pharmacy, The History and Evolution of Western Herbal Medicine by Barbara Griggs. So it's, pretty long, and it's a really good book. It's huge compared to what I'm going to be sharing with you today. But one of the things I loved about this book was one of the very first quotes in it, which I did put in your book, your PDF. So it says, in the grave of Neanderthal man, some 60,000 years ago, 60,000 years after the death of this unknown caveman, the grains of flower pollens thickly scattered in the soil surrounding his bones were identified as coming from 8 different species of flowering plants. 7 species are still used for medicine in dozens of different ways by the local people. So that's page 1. And I absolutely love that. I understand that not everybody believes in evolution, but for my historical perspective, I will be talking about it from evolution. So 60,000 years ago is a very, very long time ago. And we actually have written accounts of herbal materia. Medica appeared in India's Ayurveda about 5,000 years ago. And China's written accounts of their traditional Chinese medicine dates back to 2800 BC. And Arabic, 1500 BC, Greek Hippocrates medicine, 460 to 377 BC. And we also have 12th century findings and all the way up to today, of course. So my point is that people have been using plants as food and medicine for a minimum of 60,000 years. And of course, archaeologists have found human-like, right? Our predecessors bones and skeletons in the archaeological digs in Africa that date back 200,000 years. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, how before people, were the humans that we are today, and they didn't communicate the way that we do today and use words and the written language, they still had images and the power of observation, and they still had dreams. And they watched the animals and what was safe and not safe. And, there's other ways that they would identify plants, I'm sure, but for people back then, they really had to rely on their gut instincts and their dreams and the observations of the animals in order to know what plants were safe and not safe. And we've been using plants since the beginning of humans, ever since our kind began. All nature uses nature, right? We are part of nature. I think we just forget that because we live in our houses upon concrete and asphalt, and we forget that we really come from and used to live in complete harmony with all the nature around us, all the bacteria, all the fungi, all the viruses, all the soils and the microbes in the soils, whether they were pathogens or friendly, we all evolved with all of these things. And this is just a very brief covering of the history of plant medicines for people. We have, between religious superstitions, governments, politics, and the industrial age and corporations, most people have completely lost their indigenous plant wisdom and skills, as well as their deep inner peace that comes with the cycle of life, right? I was raised very conventionally. There was never any mention of teas and plants. I think the only plant preparation I saw was coffee. I actually never had coffee until I was, 3 years ago. I was 43. So I think that's interesting. The one plant I was raised with, I never even tried it till I was in my 40s. Anyway, so now we've reached an era in time where antibiotic resistance is the number one threat to public health that we face. And this is according to the World Health Organization. So, take it or leave it, but it's something to really consider. And we're having a whole chapter on antibiotic resistance later on. So we, the people, will have no choice but to learn how to use plants for prevention and cure once again, because the doctors are finding themselves helpless with certain bacterial infections. For example, I believe it is salmonella that has at least 8 different strains, and at least one of them, there is absolutely no man-made antibiotic that they have found effective against it. And this is because bacteria mutate very quickly in order to survive. The good news is you have bacteria within you, on your skin and in your body. We call it friendly flora. And they also can mutate very quickly in order to survive. And so we will get into all of that later. But it's important to know that that's a huge reason why we study plants and herbal medicine, is because there are some places where doctors in modern medicine are not going to be able to help us. We want to know how to help ourselves as best as we possibly can in those situations. So we need to go back in time to our ancestors' wise roots at least 60,000 years ago and learn from them. So as you learn how to work with, for example, marshmallow and yarrow, garlic and onions, one of the least expensive, most powerful herbs you will ever have, ginger and elderberries, and so many other plant allies, know that your very own ancestors did as you are doing now, connecting us through all the ages. Dream with these herbs, dance with the herbs, play in the kitchen, play in your garden if you have one. We have used a tower garden before. So many of my friends have actual soil gardens. They have land, it's so nice. And we want to pass these legacies on to our loved ones. So we're going to teach our families, our friends, our students, right? Keep this living lineage going. Keep this connection to our ancestors and the plants, all of our relatives. Keep this intact. Strengthen it with your passion and your practice. So the exercise that we're going to do within this here, I have it written out, right? But sometimes it's kind of nice to see it written out this way, or maybe you're going to see it go that way. Right? I have it written out vertically, but I love a timeline. I just think it's really fascinating. So if you have the space for it, I encourage you to tape a bunch of paper together or get a long piece of paper and create a timeline where you could see this happening. And feel free to make videos or pictures and send them to me, because that's just fun. Archaeological digs have found human Neanderthal remains in Africa dating back, 200,000 years. And it says, but I'm not aware of proof of burial, with plants back then, 200,000 years ago. So the most recent with plants in the archaeological digs buried with people and plants would be 60,000 years ago. And then I already mentioned that 5,000 years ago, we have the written Ayurvedic medicine. 4,000 years ago, we have the written traditional Chinese medicine. 3,500 years ago, we have the written Greek medicine. And then we're just going to fast forward quite a bit. And we're going to jump to the 1760s to maybe 1820, 1840. And this is the Industrial Revolution. Again, this history is very brief. So if you're interested in this topic, dive into it. But in 1760, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain. And then in 1790, it hit the United States, where our first industrial mill was opened. This era brought a measure of prosperity to the working class who had once been the city herbalists' most loyal customers. So now people are more prosperous and they want to spend their money on something more modern, like medicine, instead of going to the local herbalists. The 1870s and 1880s, they had money to spend, and they began switching their allegiance to the glamorously packaged and enticingly advertised new patent medicines. So that is, again, from Green Pharmacy by Barbara Griggs. That was on page 232. North America's New World. So we're still in the 1700s. We're just talking a little bit about what was happening back then. Europeans in America used bloodletting and mercury. This is what killed President George Washington in the late 1700s, 14th of December, 1799. It was a direct impact of the Industrial Revolution that began in the U.S. just 9 years before. Eclectic Physicians popped up as a response to bloodletting and mercury. Eclectic Physicians used herbs. They used the herbs of Europe, where they came from, and they used American indigenous practices. The Indians, Native American Indians, were very generous in teaching these immigrants how to use plants as medicine and what they had always done. And they obviously are a perfect reminder of indigenous people that did not have a written word, who had only ever used plants to survive. I think why that's so important to me is because modern medicine really hasn't been in our world for very long, 200-300 years at the most, and yet it's so quickly seen that we forget we used to be able to live without it. And I'm not really talking about emergency medicine and those advances. Those are extremely important, but just how to generally take care of ourselves, and how plants have always been used to nourish our bodies, and we probably didn't even have a lot of illnesses and problems. We probably died younger because of lack of knowledge about hygiene and lack of knowledge in keeping warm and the elements, and if there's a famine, right? So there's so many different reasons why our life expectancy was so short. But anyway, we'll just continue on here. Eclectic Physicians combined what was best in the old practices with what was best in the new practices. Now we call that integrative medicine, and I love that concept. But to only have one, I think, is very myopic, right? We love to learn about what works with the most safety and the least side effects, right? Most effective, no bad side effects. Do no harm. They focused on kindness or non-invasive strategies, these eclectic physicians, and they were affordable plant medicines and methods. And they were open to learning what chemistry could teach them. But first do no harm is still their motto. However, in 1899, the American Medical Association was incorporated, which happens to be the same year that the Bayer Company developed their drug, aspirin. The active ingredient comes from the willow bark. In the early 1900s, a lot of money was donated, were infused into the American Medical Association from big names like Rockefeller and Carnegie. Their goal was to get rid of the eclectic physicians, or anybody that was not practicing medicine according to their particular standards, which included using the chemical or patent medicine instead of plant medicine. Rockefeller and Carnegie, the Bayer Company, and more big names were set up to profit from patent chemical medicines. So, of course, if they can make plant medicines look like they don't work or like they're not effective or safe, then they will get people to buy their products so that they can make a profit. That's what businesses do, right? They want to make a profit. So in 1910, the Flexner Report was published. Carnegie and the American Medical Association succeeded in legitimizing chemical patent medicine as the standard to the public and discrediting herbal plant medicine and eclectic physicians. So that was another big step for them. You can read the Flexner Report online. You can find the PDF of it for free. In 1938, because of the effects, the consequences of the Flexner Report, in 1938, the last eclectic colleges were closed, and herbs therefore had to go underground. So herbalism was practiced in secret, but not by the general public whatsoever. Remember, the Industrial Revolution made plant medicine look out of fashion, and herbs were for the poor people. And practicing herbalism was made illegal. They called it practicing medicine without a license. So this is why we can educate about the historical uses of plants, and we can educate about the modern uses of plants and their studies, but we, of course, cannot diagnose and we cannot prescribe. We can just teach and let adults make adult decisions. Okay, so in 1953, the School of Natural Healing was founded by Dr. John Raymond Christopher, and he was born in 1935 on my daughter's birthday, so I think that's pretty awesome. And Dr. Christopher's book is one of the books that I have given you, and An Herbal Legacy of Courage was my first book that I ever read about herbs, and it's my favorite. I find it one of the most inspiring lives I've ever read about. Dr. Christopher was able to help people heal anything that they were committed to heal and do the work that it takes to heal. And in some cases, that does mean changing the personality that created the disease into the kind of person that creates health and wellness. And they did the steps and they followed his protocols and they got better of things that were deemed incurable by modern medicine. And therefore, unfortunately, Dr. Christopher went to jail many times for practicing medicine without a license, even though he was helping people to heal themselves. So he opened the school in 1953. Also in 1953, the Fitzgerald Report, a congressional record, was given. So I listed the appendices, but basically it was a proof of conspiracy within the medical establishment that was given to Congress. They asked for Fitzgerald, to do this research, and Fitzgerald reported back. So he said that there was proof of conspiracy within the medical establishment to hinder, suppress, or restrict the free flow or transmission of preparations, remedies, information, researches, investigations, experiments, demonstrations relating to the cause, prevention, methods of diagnosis and treatment of the disease cancer. So feel free to read the entire report. Again, it's a free PDF online. It is a congressional report, so it should be free to the public. In 1956, the National University of Natural Medicine were in their planning stages. So they were beginning to incorporate, and they're still now one of the best naturopathic doctors' colleges in our country. And they are still very focused on natural healing and traditional herbalism. And we're going to get to the difference between traditional herbalism versus some new form of herbalism that we tend to see a lot here in the United States and really around the world. In 1960, we did have a resurgence of herbalism and back to the land, natural lifestyles and remedies. I remember reading a book a long time ago called Back to Eden. You know, it was just a beautiful thing, right? To get back to where we're from, to build our health. And a lot of people went back to more natural living, and this created a split. So this is what happened in the 60s, is that resurgence back to the land and back to the natural way of living was it's good, it's bad, it's all the things. It created a new type of practicing herbalism, though. So the difference now, traditional herbalism based on 60,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, all the way up until the 1960s and today, was a diagnostic system, including natural traditions, most of which use the energetics of hot and cold, moist and dry. And such traditional herbalism systems include, but are not limited to, shamanism throughout the world, curanderas, eclectic physicians, Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, the Greeks' four humors, the Appalachian medicine, Southern herbalism, right? So they all have a different diagnostic system than Western medicine, and they all have a different way of treating. But traditional herbalism focuses on the energetics, like I said, of hot, cold, moist, dry, versus, the Western way of diagnosing a disease and giving it a name and then giving it a drug, right? So the new form of herbalism since the 1960s to today, they use herbs more like drugs. The chemical patent medicine is what I mean. Borrowing Western medicine's diagnostic systems and practice. For example, what herb is good for blank? So it might say diabetes or adrenal exhaustion or a cough, without giving me any specifics about the cough, right? They're just a cough. But they don't take into account the lifestyles of the people or proper nutrition, the root causes of the actual problem that they want an herb for or a drug for. Use chemical constituents. So the new form of herbalism uses chemical constituents of the herbs to understand physiological function rather than the whole herb synergistically. For example, aspirin is derived from a chemical constituent found in white willow bark. And the drug digitalis is derived from a chemical constituent of the plant digitalis known as foxglove. So another example is that an apple has 10,000 phytonutrients. Yes, 10,000 phytonutrients. So one constituent does not a whole apple make. Am I right? So this is exactly what they're doing to our herbs, to our plants, is they're taking a look at a plant like turmeric, and they look at all the components. They've identified 100 of who knows how many phytonutrients are in there. If it's anything like an apple, it could have thousands, right? And they look at that and they say, oh, curcumin is the one active important ingredient. And they do not take into account how all of the phytonutrients of the plant work together within a human body to create health, to create the result that they're studying it for. They want, to get rid of arthritis or inflammation or whatever it is, right? And instead of looking at what is causing that and considering the entirety of the plant and how it works together so that we don't have negative side effects and so that we don't overdose and cause death or major damages, they just isolate it. They isolate that one thing and they patent that. So turmeric as a whole herb has been used for at least 5,000 years successfully. And now this new form of herbalism would suggest taking a capsule of curcumin and expect the same results with no consideration of the root cause for the ailment nor the whole plant, how it works synergistically within our bodies. There's so much involved with this. So that's the end of today's historical lesson. Again, extremely brief, but it's really important to know the difference between traditional herbalism versus more modern herbalism, because we're going to be focusing on traditional herbalism, looking at the root causes. And honestly, we are going to be looking at the physical and scientific aspects of the herbs, but we're also going to be looking at how they affect the body, mind, heart, and soul. And that's how sometimes if you know this herb, this herb, this herb, this herb, this herb, these are all known to help with this physical thing, right? But then you want to know more about those herbs and their energetics so that you can pick out what is right for this specific person and their personality and their specific energetics. Traditional herbalism is much more effective than, I would say, the modern herbalism or maybe Western herbalism. It just depends on the kind of Western herbalist, right? So there's nothing wrong with Western herbalism. It just depends on how they're approaching the person. So anyway, that is the end of history. A very, very brief history. So we will see you in the next video about herbal preparations, and we will be making our very first herbal preparation in the next video or two, and it's super simple and extremely effective. So have a beautiful day, and we'll see you in the next video.